A little later, the Apollo mission was consummated, and there were Americans on the moon. I remember distinctly looking up from the quad on what was quite a moon-flooded night, and thinking about it. They made it. The stars and stripes are finally flown on another orb. Also, English becomes the first and only language spoken on a neighboring rock. Who could forbear to cheer? Still, the experience was poised for me by having to watch Richard Nixon smirking as he babbled to the lunar knots by some closed-circuit link. Was even the silvery orb to be tainted by the base, earthbound reality of imperialism? At around this time, I also met my first U.S. Senator, Hugh Scott, the Republican from Pennsylvania. He had been seconded to Balliol for some special relationship purpose and was occasionally wheeled out to put a respectable face on things. He's rather forgotten now, but Norman Mailer had caught the tailor's dummy, all things to all men aspect of the senatorial mine in a thumbnail sketch from the fateful Nixon convention in Miami in 1968. Scott had modest but impeccable aplomb as he explained that since only 12% of the delegates had been in San Francisco in 1964, he did not expect bitterness from the old Goldwater followers to hurt Rockefeller's chances now. A fine character actor had been lost when Hugh Scott went into politics. He could have played the spectrum from butler to count. Alarming though, American politics and politicians seemed, especially as one devoured Mailer's punchy and instant paperbacked reporting from the street fights outside the Pentagon and the party conclaves, I didn't fail to register the note of thwarted patriotism that he sometimes sounded when he was writing about himself in the third person. A profound part of him detested the thought of seeing his American society, evil, absurd, touching, pathetic, sickening, comic, full of novelistic marrow, disappear now in the nihilistic maw of a national disorder. In one way, this reeked of Mailer's showbiz reluctance to lose a country that supplied him with such a good copy. But I thought I could detect the pulse of patriotic sympathy in him, too, if only because I also felt it latently in myself. Experience with communists and fellow travelers in Cuba and elsewhere had made me somewhat immune to the sort of propaganda that emphasized Uncle Sam or the Yankee, let alone that sort that burned the American flag. This style, which usually warned one of the presence of the peace-loving and progressive forces, also reminded me of the snobbish and even chauvinistic anti-Americanism that I'd overheard on the British right. Trying to keep all these reflections in balance, in late July 1970, I bought a bucket shop ticket for a charter flight via Iceland to John F. Kennedy Airport. Sometimes an expectation or wish does not come true. I have no faith in precognitive dreams, or any patience for dream rhetoric in general. Yet Manhattan was exactly as I had hoped it would be. I had to survive some very discouraging first impressions. The airport cafe where I ate my first breakfast was a nothingness of plastic and formica, and the English muffin was a travesty of both Englishness and muffindom. Outside stood a paunchy cop with, on his heavy belt, an accoutrement of gun and club and handcuff of a sort that I had never seen in real life and had believed exaggerated in the movies. The bus into the city was sweaty, and the Port Authority terminal is probably the worst possible place from which to take your original bearings on Midtown. The next thing I actually saw in the city was a flag-bedecked campaign headquarters for the ultra-right candidacy of James Buckley, brother of William F. for the Senate. "Join the March for America," it yelled, but I was near delirious. Gazing up at the pillared skyline, I knew that I was surveying a tremendous work of man, buying myself a drink in the smaller warrens below, in all their ethnic variety and willingness to keep odd and late hours, and provide plentiful ice cubes and free matchbooks, in contrast to English parsimony in these matters. I felt the same thing in a different way. The balance between the macro and the micro, the heroic scale and the human scale, has never since ceased to fascinate and charm me. Evelyn Waugh was in error when he said that in New York there was a neurosis in the air which the inhabitants mistook for energy. There was rather a tensile excitement in that air which made me think for many years that time spent asleep in New York was somehow time wasted. Whether this thought has lengthened or shortened my life I shall never know, but it has certainly colored it. In the streets and avenues of this amazing city, There was barely a crew cut to be seen, and everybody's trousers, if they wore any trousers, seemed to equal to the task of covering the ankle, if not indeed the entire shoe. Bell-bottoms may have been involved. With skirts, though, the reverse process applied. In some manner, the whole place was redolent of sex, but in a natural rather than a leering way. Three big differences between this culture and the English one began to disclose themselves at once. The first was the extraordinary hospitality. Balliol College had equipped me with a list of former alumni who were willing to put me up, and this comprised some fairly solid citizens all across the USA. But Americans to whom one had barely been introduced would also insist that one came for a weekend on the shore or upstate, and would actually mean it. On the way to any destination, if you put your thumb on the roadside, you would almost immediately get a lift or a ride. To set this down now makes me bite my lip as I mourn the lapse of time and the passing of hitchhiking. And very often the driver would go out of his or her way to drop you where you wanted to go. Music on the radio would be loud and various as the trip progressed, and if there was any song more evocative of those days than Go Where You Want to Go, it was the schmaltzy haunting Leaving on a Jet Plane. Should you happen to be in need of a jet plane, you could go to the airport and try your luck. It costing nothing to acquire a standby youth fare card, and once equipped with this proof of mere youthfulness, you could wait in the boarding area and snap up any unbought seat for a few dollars. I first flew across the Great Lakes from New York to Chicago in this manner, in brilliant sunshine, on a plane where I was the sole passenger, and the tawny, lissom American Airlines hostesses treated me as if I paid for first class. In Britain, intercity travel meant crummy station platforms and delayed and dirty trains run by resentful oldsters. To really feel the connection between youth and freedom, and somehow nothing did this for me more than the experience of flight, I had also had to flee. My trip to Chicago, where I was rather chilled to see the egotistic, minatory signs on the airport road welcoming me in the name of Richard J. Daley, Mayor, also happened to coincide with the first celebration of International Women's Day. All through the downtown loop, one sun-drenched lunchtime, a great avalanche of pulchritude filled the plazas just as music and fighting speeches moved the air. I felt the stirrings and yearnings of another civil rights movement, triggered by an earlier one that still had some distance to run. In a distant undertone, I also felt the premonition of identity politics, but believe me, to see the womanhood of Chicago en fete in all its bird of paradise variety that day was not something to give you any pinched or narrow conception of things. Hospitality, easy riding, and easy flying. Could it get any better? Mr. Coolidge had decreed that all those accepting his scholarship money should be unaccompanied by females. After voyaging up to stay with him in his magnificent home in Topsfield, Massachusetts, and putting in my time lying on his pool patio, and being discreetly growled and purred at, I felt somewhat released from this obligation. He threw an all-male lunch which included the then president of Harvard, a man with a near-perfect New England name of Nathan Pusey, and perhaps a hint of austere attenuation in his gray pant leggings. My girlfriend was coming to the United States anyway, and in those days, if you bought the ticket outside the country, you could travel on the Greyhound bus system for 99 days and $99. This was even better than youth fare. I told her to buy and bring 2 tickets. Seeing America by road turned out to be even finer than gazing at it from the sky. For all the indifference I felt toward the shallow concept of Woodstock Nation, there was in those days a sort of underground vernacular for people under age of 21. A brisk flash of the peace sign would get you a roadside lift even more quickly than the showing of a mere thumb. And if you needed to borrow a floor or a bunk, there was a similar idiom, often to do with the verses of Bob Dylan. It comes back to me that on one of those big smooth rocks on the edges of Central Park, someone had painted in giant letters, "He not busy being born is busy dying," and underneath it the deranged weatherman flash of a W with a superimposed lightning bolt, and then the subtitle, "Make the Pigs Pay." It was possible to voyage all over the United States for a few dollars a day, sometimes sleeping a night on the bus when it was crossing the emptier bits, but then getting off and staying, not just with a list of Balliol alumni, but with individuals and even collectives on the informal list of the American branch of the International Socialists. This double act worked well enough in Detroit. We stayed with a snowy-haired, ramrod-straight old Union man named Carl Haisler, who had been in Balliol before the First World War and in jail with Eugene Victor Debs, grand old man of American socialism, during and after it. From his home we got ourselves introduced to the Black Caucus. On the assembly line at the Hamtramck and Flint auto plants, these hard guys were extremely scornful of the petit bourgeois adventurism of the Black Panthers, and were taken to a free rock concert on a vacant lot not far from the headquarters of General Motors itself. In those days, there were several cities where you could still smell the riots and burnings of not so very long before, and Detroit was one of them. But it didn't work so well in Salt Lake City, say, where Balliol men and Trotskyists alike were as rare as rocking horse droppings, and one had little choice but to take the tour of the Mormon Tabernacle and notice the John Birch Society bookshop that was right next door to it. Beautiful as Salt Lake City was, with its street plan leading to white-topped horizons in every direction, and lovely as Utah was, with its main church having only just had the needful revelation that black people might have human souls after all, it was a slight relief to cross the frontier of Nevada and breathe the bracingly sordid and amoral air of Reno and Las Vegas. The variety and scope of contrast of this country seemed limitless. And then the bus began to cruise lazily through Sacramento toward the Bay Area, and into the then Mecca of the radical style. The best of that scene was probably over, because by the time you have heard of such a scene it had almost invariably moved on or decayed. But I had already formed a sharply new picture of life in the United States, and exposure to California did little to dull my enthusiasm. Here was a country that could engage in frightening and debilitating and unjust war, and undergo a simultaneously convulsion of its cities on the question of justice for its oldest and largest minority, and start a national conversation on the rights of women, and turn its most respectable campuses into agitated seminars on right and wrong, and have a show trial of confessed saboteurs in Chicago where the incredibly guilty defendants actually got off, and put quite a lot of this onto its television and movie screens in real time. This seemed like a state of affairs worth fighting for, or at least fighting over.